It was October 30th, 1938, just past 8 o'clock at night. CBS Radio interrupted its regular programming to announce that a strange flying machine had crashed at Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton.
We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Moments later, came the announcement that people approaching the object had been struck down by a mysterious death ray. The invasion had begun.
Shape is rising out of the pit. They make out a small beam of light against a mirror.
Armed with their incredible war machines, these Martian invaders were destroying everything in their path. There would be no stopping this army.
Lord, they're turning into flames. By the woods of
It would take the Martian invaders no longer than an hour to conquer the entire world. And the mastermind behind this devastating attack was the theatrical genius, Orson Welles.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Since the early days of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, many people have wondered about the true origin of these sightings. Could UFOs be a sign of external forces, or does their mystique have a more sociological origin? How is it that UFOs have changed over the past 50 years, from classic flying saucers to ominous black triangles? The changes in stories of alien encounters are even stronger proof of this evolution. Just a half-century ago, aliens looked more like goblins in spacesuits than small people with big bug eyes. How can we explain this change in the way they look?
In the last 50 years, there has been a noticeable evolution in UFO phenomena. In the early 1950s, you had your basic flying saucer that had a tendency to break down from time to time, like your trusty old Ford. Braver aliens would stop and ask to borrow a screwdriver to repair their ship. The next big trends were alien abductions and encounters with humanoids. Then, in the early 1990s, there were waves of triangle sightings. It seems that there has been an evolution in UFOs and aliens.
In actual fact, this evolution has a familiar ring to it, since aliens have evolved in science fiction as well.
In 1978, Bertrand Meilloust, a philosopher by trade, published a book that essentially revolutionized the way we think about UFOs, called Science Fiction et Secours Volants, literally Science Fiction and Flying Saucers. In it, he made a connection between UFOs and science fiction that apparently no one else had thought of. He compared flying saucer stories from after 1947 with popular science fiction stories prior to 1947. He found many interesting similarities, such as saucer-shaped objects, beams of light, small aliens with big heads, and abductions. It was all there in science fiction. How do we explain such a coincidence? The most obvious answer is that people who report UFO sightings must be avid readers of science fiction, case closed. But Meilloust contended from the start that the answer is not as simple as that. He presented a number of different hypotheses to explain the phenomenon, but the similarities between the two just kept on growing over time. More recently, Michel Merget, an authority on the history of science fiction, suggested that people who see UFOs are a bit like science science fiction writers. Their stories, which are at least partly fictional, are based on ideas that they have already been exposed to. They are a product of their culture.
Donc des récits qui étaient quand même plus ou moins artificiels. Donc tout ça a été une création culturelle.
Proponents of this psychological theory were quick to adopt Michel Murger's book Alien Abduction, published in 1995, over Bertrand Meust's earlier works.
What I was trying to accomplish with that book was to put my observations down on paper. The history of UFOs began in 1947. Books on UFOs had existed for 20 years before that, which meant that American readers were already familiar with the concepts of disc-shaped crafts, flying saucers, and small pilots with big heads, small pilots who abduct people. It was all there in American science fiction magazines, so it could be said that these alien stories were all simply based on these fictional models. For example, science fiction introduced the idea of men in black, who are now a well-known phenomenon in UFO circles. They're often suspected of being aliens in disguise who visit and harass UFO witnesses. As early as 1930, a document by Fortean Edmund Hamilton described one of these beings disguised as a human going around abducting or killing people because they knew too much. You get the general idea. So you see, there are distinct correlations between American fiction of the 1920s and 30s and UFO stories reported later on. That being said, there's no way of knowing precisely how the transference occurred. It would take a highly specialized sociological study that, for all intents and purposes, would be next to impossible to conduct today.
So to what extent could aliens in science fiction have actually influenced the accounts of UFO sightings? Do people subconsciously draw on science fiction folklore to embellish their stories? Or do they really experience what they claim? Some extraordinary technological advances were made at the end of the 19th century, including the telephone, gramophone, diesel engine, X-rays, and the radio. In 1886, Jules Verne wrote Robert the Conqueror, a novel in which the hero travels the world in an amazing flying machine, a cross between a boat and a blimp. At about the same time, strange objects began to appear in the sky over the United States. It was the dawn of airships, flying machines that looked more like dirigibles than spaceships. While some people saw this coincidence as an uncanny parallel to science fiction, others saw it differently.
When discussing the influence of science fiction on UFO sightings, people will often bring up the wave of airships over the United States in 1897. During the Great Airship, as it was known, one or more objects were seen flying over the country. Some people even claim to have met the occupants. Rationalists pointed to Robert the Conqueror and other futuristic novels, as sci-fi novels were known back then, saying that they had influenced journalists to create these tall tales, which was probably true in some cases. But literature wasn't the main cause of the wave. There was just something in the air at the time. Patents were being issued for inventions that bore a striking resemblance to the strange flying machines of the day. Machines made with Victorian technology, not just nuts and bolts, but heavy-duty hardware. These were machines that should not have been able to fly at all. Still, people claim to have seen giant steel cylinders with paddle wheels flying in the skies. Very strange indeed. We need to consider the possibility that people really did see these older UFOs. This is a subject that has always been of great interest to me, because these sightings occurred before 1947. Before man had begun to fly, before the invention of any aviation technology. And I guess it's entirely possible that people found old pictures from that era and touched them up, claiming that they showed what was seen in the sky at the time. Maybe that's how we ended up with those pictures of flying cigars or hovering discs taken from unusual angles.
So were these stories made up or just a sign of the times? The debate continues. There are countless examples, starting with the so-called abduction of Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. In her account, given mostly under hypnosis, Betty Hill reported that she had undergone a pregnancy test that involved inserting a long needle into her navel. There is a scene that is practically identical in Invaders from Mars, a science fiction movie that came out in 1953, 8 years before the Hill ordeal. In addition to the pregnancy test, Invaders from Mars also depicted extraterrestrials using radio transmitter implants to control the minds of their victims. There was no mention of implants in UFO stories from the 1940s and 50s, but they became incredibly popular during the 1980s. Can we just chalk up these abduction stories to the influence of science fiction in the media? Could it be that some abductions are genuine, while others are imaginary?
I guess you could say that the issue here is whether some abductions are authentic and some are just hoaxes and delusions. We live in a world of mass culture. If we're European or Canadian, we are very influenced by American mass culture. Let's not forget that thousands of stories have been influencing people since the 1920s and 30s. Plus, there were all those sci-fi movies from the 1950s depicting alien invasions. Even American cartoons featured aliens. That's a lot of exposure to the idea of aliens. And I think that people's minds just got saturated. To put it in visual terms, it's like we're living in a big fish tank, so it seems to me that it must be difficult to distinguish between a fake abduction and a genuine one. I think that as soon as potential scenarios are presented, that's good enough for me personally.
It may not be as simple as that. While some people attach a deep significance to these connections, others see them as mere coincidences.
There is no doubt in my mind that the witnesses experienced the events as real. You see, for the most part, they're just honest people, giving their version of something they really think happened to them. They believe that their interpretation is the honest-to-God truth. Their stories are not pure fiction, although there are definite similarities between the accounts they give and some elements of science fiction. But then again, you can find pretty much everything in science fiction. What I find interesting, and what, in my opinion, theorists like Michel Murger have not been able to fully explain, is why science fiction only influences certain aspects of witness accounts. Why are descriptions of aliens always the same in every story? Why is it that the bug-eyed monsters of 1930s science fiction have caught on, but not any other space monsters? Why doesn't anyone ever see little green men? Why do aliens perform the exact same tests every time? These types of questions are fundamental, but neither school of thought has been able to answer them yet.
Curiously enough, the theory that UFOs originated in science fiction was most popular in Europe, and particularly in France. The science fiction community is a lot like the ufology community. Science fiction isn't considered total trash, but then again, it certainly isn't considered in the same league as classic literature or film. The science fiction community has the same problem gaining recognition as the ufology community. Somewhere along the way, science fiction writers came to be known as myth makers, a role they were all too pleased to assume. But this seemed to occur only in Europe. For some reason, it never made its way across the ocean to the United States, where sci-fi writers never talk about that theory.
As a matter of fact, even though the United States is quite large, science fiction magazines were not really as popular as Michel Murger would lead us to believe. In order for us to believe that they were the original source of myths, they would have had to have been extremely popular, which has not been proven.
You have to consider that in the 1920s and 30s, especially in the U.S., there were entire commissions in charge of protecting the youth from violence, or aliens, or anything else that might give them nightmares. In all likelihood, it was just another form of censorship. In other words, it was thought to be in their youth's best interest to keep them from being exposed to those magazines. I suppose that this may partly explain their lack of popularity during that period. And it's also important to remember that there were major differences between the literature aimed at youth and the literature aimed at adults back then.
Long before there were reports of UFO landings, aliens had infiltrated society through science fiction. Today, some people credit science fiction with having created part of our UFO knowledge base, specifically with regards to alien abductions. But still, the sci-fi culture remains on the fringes of society. Is it possible that this culture could have been responsible for one of the most surprising phenomena of the 20th century? Just as UFO literature took ideas from science fiction, likewise science fiction took ideas from UFO literature. Series like The X-Files and movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind borrowed extensively from UFO literature. It boils down to the age-old debate of the chicken and the egg.
If we look back at when aliens first began to appear in science fiction, one of the first things that comes to mind is H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds, written in 1898. In that book, aliens invaded London, England. But there was no widespread alien invasion in literature at the time. It would still be a few more years before they would really become popular. It wasn't until around the mid-1920s or perhaps early 1930s that pulp magazines began to appear on magazine stands throughout America. That's when people's imaginations really started to take off. It was relatively easy to get stories published in those magazines. Aliens at that time were invaders or big ugly creatures out to harm humans. In futuristic novels, on the other hand, they were portrayed as travelers and explorers. That's when the whole phenomenon really began to develop. There were the inventions at the turn of the century, plus the industrial and technological revolutions. Authors back then had far-fetched ideas, although reality seeped in now and then. Seeds were being planted for the television, the laser, and the whole telecommunications industry. In the beginning, aliens didn't have much in the way of a personality. They were just big, ugly monsters. Then eventually, in the 1940s and 50s, they began to evolve, with writer Philippe Joseph Armer, who tried to portray them as having a personality. He also tried to portray intergalactic relations between Earthlings and extraterrestrials. So basically, that was how aliens and UFOs evolved early in the 20th century. Then along came the comic book, which introduced us to the most famous extraterrestrial of all, Superman, protector of the human race. Superheroes are a whole other aspect of aliens that we mustn't forget.
In the United States, science fiction appeared primarily in cheap magazines, known as pulp magazines, or pulps for short.
The first one to become popular was Argosy, which came out in 1896. But the real wave of pulp popularity was between 1923 and 1926. They were around for about half of the 1920s. The first one that was really of the science fiction genre was written by Hugo Gernsback, a Luxembourg immigrant living in the United States. He was a big fan of technology, which he used as material for his first sci-fi pulp magazine called Amazing Stories. He also created a fantasy series called Weird Tales. What followed was that most, if not all, well-known American science fiction writers ended up contributing stories to pulp magazines, which earned their name from the poor quality of the paper that they were printed on. You could still see bits of pulp in the paper itself. This is where the space operas originated. There were grandiose stories about invasions and the valiant heroes who stopped them. Heroes like Flash Gordon. Buck Rogers and Doc Savage. Not only did they have their own pulp magazines, but they also appeared in other series as well. They fended off evil invaders who were threatening to oppress smaller territories and planets. They were simple adventure stories, nothing more. The most exotic thing about them was probably the costumes and the appearance of the characters. The pulp's heyday was really in the 1930s, but it all came to an end in the early 1950s, with the advent of television and drive-in movie theaters, along with new technology in media. At that point, science fiction moved more into paperback novels, and pulp magazines virtually disappeared. Still, they are an important part of the legacy of science fiction literature, because they were more or less where it all began, and everyone was involved in them. Later on, sci-fi buffs got together and founded fan clubs all over the world, which in some ways paralleled the pulp magazines. They carried on the tradition of science fiction and kept the big-name authors on the cultural radar.
In the wake of World War II, science fiction gained a new audience through movies and television. Flying saucers could be seen in theaters throughout America, just when it was too worried about a Soviet invasion to be concerned about a Martian one. All that really mattered was that these visitors from outer space were a moneymaker.
Pulps basically fell off the face of the earth in the 1950s, when they were replaced with television and movies. There were a few juvenile TV shows like Space Rangers, but basically movies played a bigger role in teaching the public about aliens. In previous decades, things had been more subtle. There had been more mad scientists and vampires. Then in the 1950s, we had these big Hollywood productions like Forbidden Planet and The Thing that really tried to depict first contact between humans and aliens. These movies were a disaster. Aliens were either totally misunderstood or they were portrayed as some kind of a threat. Directors came up with all kinds of characters, scenarios, and planets. Television also picked up on the trend. Countless series came out, especially Saturday morning cartoons like Space Ghost. The movie industry found that it could make a profit from movies about aliens. So directors began cranking out a whole series of low-budget films. A lot of studios figured that they could make a quick buck out of the alien fad, so they started working with plastic models of aliens. It soon became a global trend, popping up in Italy, Japan, everywhere. There weren't too many movies trying to make a statement, with the possible exception of a few American films in the early 1950s.
The influence of science fiction can also be seen in the messages received by contactees in the 1950s. In The Day the Earth Stood Still, Klaatu, an alien played by Michael Rennie, claimed that he had come to warn man against his aggressive ways. Less than a year later, a man named George Adamski revealed that an alien from the planet Venus had come to him to warn him about humanity's hostile tendencies. Just like Adamski's claims, science fiction movies began to reflect the concerns of society at the time.
There is a kind of symbolism in science fiction if you look at the way films have evolved over the years. For instance, in the 1950s, there were a lot of movies about invasions that paralleled the social climate of that decade. Think back to the McCarthy era and all the witch hunts. Communism was rampant. It was all about rooting out the Reds. That's why the planet Mars, the Red Planet, was often used to represent the enemy. Red Planet, Red Army, they were all the same during the Cold War. Political tensions were starting to subside by the time Star Trek came on the scene. And Star Trek's mission and message were much more peaceful. The show reflected the political climate. People were watching what was happening in Vietnam and what was going on in Iran with Ayatollah Khomeini. So there have always been trends that follow the world political situation. Then along came E.T. in 1982. And all of a sudden, aliens could be funny. There were TV shows with aliens on them, like that furry little guy Alf, who was taken in by an Earth family. There were other shows like it as well. Media have always shifted in cycles. Today we have both good aliens and bad aliens. The same thing goes for vampires. It's just a big cycle. And it all depends on the social conditions of the time.
In hindsight, it's much easier to spot the connections, like in the case of Adamski's visitor from Venus and the alien in the day the Earth stood still, or the implants that so-called abductees talk about, and the devices used in invaders from Mars. But is this enough to claim that a phenomenon as complicated as UFOs is the direct result of aliens appearing in the media?
It seems a little far-fetched to me because, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I'm a big fan of science fiction literature myself, it simply isn't all that important in the great scheme of things. In 1947, there was only American sci-fi that was known worldwide, and it wasn't that popular even in the United States. Science fiction magazine sales were 10 to 20 times lower than adventure and Western magazines. Movies weren't around yet. Sci-fi literature was generally geared towards juvenile adolescents and comic book readers. It never reached the same mythical proportions as the Western did in America. It's just not logical that it would have created a myth that suddenly swept through the country. If it had been something out of a Western, that might have made a little more sense. Science fiction crept gradually into society. You could see it in the movies of the 1950s and 60s, where there were a lot of flying saucers. Industry was just following popular trends. If UFOs hadn't been so popular, they wouldn't have appeared on the silver screen. There were few, if any, screenplays that depicted UFO sightings as they were reported. The basic plot line stayed the same, but flying saucers were added for theatrics.
Earth versus the Flying Saucers is a classic example of Hollywood theatrics loosely reflecting reality. Filmed in 1956, this movie depicted aliens attacking Washington, D.C. and destroying the Washington Monument and the dome of the Capitol building. The film came out 4 years after the famous Washington Carousel incident. In July 1952, UFOs were seen flying over the nation's capital. This event received more media coverage than any other in UFO history. The closing scene of the movie was obviously inspired by the events of 1952. Yet another example of art imitating life. The truth is that the psychological theory is nothing more than a caricature of real UFO incidents. Some say that Betty Hill was merely influenced by the movie Invaders from Mars. If that's so, then what about the radar echoes? On the night the couple claims to have been abducted, 2 unidentified radar echoes were reported for the same time and sector as those described by the Hills. It's plausible that the Hills were influenced by science fiction, but it's a lot harder to believe that military radar could have been. Proponents of the psychosocial theory ignore any physical evidence, choosing to speak of UFOs only in terms of apparitions. They also believe that witnesses are so impressionable that it's next to impossible to find any objective evidence in their stories. In their minds, simply showing a science fiction movie might be enough to set off a rash of UFO sightings. For investigators in the field, however, this is just not true.
It seems that there were a lot more UFO sightings reported in the past than there are these days. The 1970s are a perfect example, because there were a great deal more sightings per year throughout that decade. To give you a better idea of what that means, today we get about 50 sightings reported every year. Back in the 70s, we were getting well over 100 sightings every year. Specifically, there were a lot of reports classified under Category D, events that remained unexplained given the data provided in the account. Basically, there are no conclusive findings in all of this. Some people have tried to claim that when movies appear like E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or more recently Independence Day and Mars Attack, the number of UFO sightings increases. That's just not true. Statistics show that there is no correlation whatsoever between movies or television shows about aliens and the number of UFO sightings reported. In actual fact, What happens most of the time is that a person comes face to face with something that they do not understand, and they contact the police in the hopes of getting an answer to the mystery. Of all the sightings that are reported, practically none of them turn out to be a hoax. I would say maybe one hoax per 1,000 cases reported.
Ce que représente le canular dans tous ces témoignages, ça ne représente pratiquement zéro. On a peut-être 1 pour 1000 de canulars par rapport à l'ensemble des témoignages qui ont été recueillis.
And the influence of sci-fi on witness accounts appears to be much less significant than supporters of the psychosocial theory would have us believe.
Là aussi, quand on étudie scrupuleusement les témoignages, on s'aperçoit.
When you thoroughly examine UFO accounts, you can see that science fiction literature has no direct influence on them.
Dans le témoignage,
you can tell that these people truly want to know more about something that they experienced or saw, but which somehow eludes them. It's pretty easy to notice when a person is intentionally trying to inject their own beliefs into their account. In my opinion, these accounts are something spontaneous that results from self-questioning.
Je dirais, est quelque chose de spontané qui reflète un état d'interrogation.
Of course, there's always the possibility that the media is promoting a much less noble cause. While some people see the media as creators of myths, others think the opposite. In their view, which borders on paranoia, the film industry is controlled by authorities who want to use science fiction movies to prepare the population for the terrifying reality of alien contact. At least that's what a lot of conspiracy theorists tend to believe. According to them, this is what the powers that be need to do in order to prevent a war of the worlds. On October 30th, 1938, the Mercury Theater Company gathered in the studios of the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS as it's known in New York, to broadcast an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds. Published in 1898, the novel described Mars' invasion of Earth. Overseeing the production was 23-year-old Orson Welles. In his adaptation, Wells changed the story into a series of news flashes, inspired in part by Herb Morrison, a journalist who had reported live on the Hindenburg disaster 1 year earlier.
I can't talk to people. His friends are out there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen.
On est en 1138.
Let's go back to 1938. We need to remember the climate of the time. For starters, there had been the stock market crash in 1929. World War I had ended fairly recently, and there were rumors of another war brewing in Europe. Amidst all this, Wells decided to stage a Martian landing on Earth. The story developed gradually over the course of the broadcast. So, it was Halloween night in the fall of 1938, and Orson Welles was presenting this play. It had been advertised in the newspapers a few times, and during the broadcast itself, there were 3 or 4 announcements indicating that it was only a play.
Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
It was set up as a sort of show within a show, appearing to be a big band music program. The music program was interrupted, saying that activity had been noticed on the planet Mars, but they weren't too sure what was happening and listeners should stay tuned.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars.
They continued to interrupt the music program with news flashes whenever important information came in, just like the media do now. There were around 6 million listeners, and they say that about 1/6, or 1 million, of those people were genuinely frightened or panicked by the show.
The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Helen,
Not found
come
on
here.
this Earth. Friction with
Listen.
the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth.
The Martian.
Keep those men back.
Oh my God.
It does it.
Martians. I'm gonna call John.
Gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed.
There's no line.
Try it. Try again.
Get the flame spraying in the mirror and at least try to be advancing men. Strike them head on.
There's no line. I mean, it's real.
Here's one by the woods of fires. There's gas tanks for the automobiles spreading everywhere. Wait out.
I think it's the end. Oh, gosh.
What's important about this broadcast is that it received huge media coverage afterwards. And there were reports that people had actually gone to New Jersey to see if Martians had indeed landed in that farmer's field. So many people reacted to the show that a study was published a year or two later, referred to as the Cantrill study. In the week following the broadcast, Hadley Cantrill interviewed 4 different categories of people. Those who had listened to the show and figured out that it was just a fictional story. Those who had listened to the show and had to check if it was real or not. Had aliens really landed on Earth? And then there were the 2 other categories. People who tried to find out if it was real, but who continued to listen as if it was, and people who blindly assumed that it was real and made no attempts to find out for sure.
Cantrill's study, entitled The Invasion from Mars, was one of the first of its kind to focus on the influence of media on popular beliefs.
You have to understand that what Cantrill's study shows is that there were a variety of contributing factors. There were the social and political climates that I already mentioned, plus there were personal factors, such as a lack of critical thinking, which led to some people's prejudices or instincts being influenced by this group of actors. Also, depending on their level of education, some people could have been more gullible than others, or at least more personally insecure. All of these personal factors still exist in today's society. There are still people who are less secure, less informed, who listen to gossip, etc. So are we really very different today than people were back then? There are probably differences in the social and political climates now, although there are still a lot of similarities between the 2 periods. We still hear talk of war, and we still see economic problems. What has changed is the number of readily available information sources. What set this study apart was that it did not focus on the power of the media per se. Rather, it looked at the psychological, sociological, and interpersonal aspects of people's reactions. It revealed that our level of critical thinking can make a difference in whether or not we panic, and to what degree we might be influenced by the media. In other words, whether the media has enough power to make us think or do almost anything.
What Cantrill concluded in his study was proven repeatedly afterwards. An adaptation of Orson Welles' play aired twice in South America, in Santiago, Chile in 1944, and in Quito, Ecuador in 1949. In both cases, the program incited mass hysteria. In Quito, when it was learned that the show was fictional, hundreds of angry listeners set the radio station on fire. These violent reactions bolstered the argument of those who believe that the use of aliens in mass media serves an educational purpose. Those people feel that the panic experienced by radio listeners is a classic example of what would happen if the government announced tomorrow that aliens had landed on Earth.
Something that always comes up in discussions about UFOs in the media, something that dates back before UFOs were popular, is the Orson Welles production of The War of the Worlds in 1938. It set off mass hysteria. The question is, what would happen if the government said, "It's true, they're here"? Some say that people would react the same way today as they did back in 1938. I think that in 1938, the effects of the Wells broadcast spiraled out of control. It produced this heightened sense of panic, and there were people who honestly thought it was real because they hadn't heard the announcement that it was just a play. The fact that there were traffic jams and a mass hysteria throughout the entire state of New York, well, it's as if the newspapers were in on it with CBS, the network that aired the program. Okay, so people fell for this prank in 1938, although perhaps less than we may think. It happened again in France in 1946 with Jean Nochet's Plateforme 70, except in that case, the crisis was a nuclear war instead of an alien invasion. In 1949, War of the Worlds was presented in Ecuador. When people there found out that it wasn't real, they burned down the radio station. But nowadays, with the internet, it just wouldn't be the same. Soon we'll all be at the point where we'll be getting news before it even happens. The play worked back in Wells' day because people couldn't just pick up a phone and call Grover's Mill to find out if a Martian spaceship had really landed. These days, you just have to click on the internet and you instantly know what's real and what isn't. Not to mention the number of television channels there are now. It would be pretty impossible to pull off something like the War of the Worlds today. Then again, if the president were to appear on television today and announce that aliens had landed, obviously it would be somewhat of a shock. But it wouldn't cause mass hysteria like Orson Welles' play did. I don't see how that could happen. There's just no argument for that theory.
From the science fiction magazines of the 30s to present-day movies like Signs, it's clear that a number of ideas have impacted on the collective consciousness. But the media is only one part of the equation.
Science fiction literature definitely played a role in the 20s and 30s, and science fiction is still playing a role today. Just look at the movie Signs from 2002. There's a definite interest in things that are strange, out of the ordinary. I'm not talking about everyone, but there are a lot of people that this applies to, and I don't think that will ever change. I think to some degree, there's a demand for this kind of thing. How well that demand is met is a different issue, but there's a definite fascination with it. Earlier, we spoke of the impact of Orson Welles' play on South America when it aired down there 3 years later. But we don't have to go as far as Chile or Ecuador to see how fascinated people are by aliens. In 1980, a small community station outside of Montreal announced that aliens had landed near Mont Saint-Hilaire, and some 800 people went to check it out. That was in 1980, which is not that long ago. Science fiction may not fill a vital need, but I think it fills a need that people have to fantasize. Some things that were mere fantasy back in the 1930s and 40s have become reality in the new millennium, especially in the areas of technology and transportation. There's a fine line between fact and fiction, and sometimes it's hard to tell where the line begins and where it ends.
The Cantrell studies show that the influence of the media on our beliefs is a personal matter. Even if you support the theory that authorities were trying to manipulate the population, it's a bit of a stretch to say that that alone could be enough to convince the entire population that aliens exist.
There are a lot of different influences, and for people who allow it, the mass media can become a source of influence. So when they're in line at the grocery store and they read a headline about some Hollywood celebrity being abducted by Martians, if they're already inclined to believe what's in the tabloids, and if they read a lot about aliens and so on, seeing that headline might just be proof enough for them. The media's job is to present the different issues of the day. It's up to us to figure out what's true and what isn't. Hopefully, the majority of people still have some analytical abilities and are capable of critical thinking. But given a situation where both the external and internal factors come into play, a person might experience confirmation bias and see what they want to believe.
If UFOs are nothing but a myth born out of pop culture, then whatever happened to the monsters and robots of early sci-fi novels? And if the media was just a puppet used by the government to prepare the world for the big revelation that aliens are real, then its efforts were clearly in vain. The number of people who believe in aliens is about the same today as in 1950. Studying UFOs without taking pop culture into account would be an exercise in futility. You'd have to be blind to miss the remarkable coincidences between science fiction and the field of ufology. But you'd have to be just as blind to chalk up the whole UFO phenomenon to the single explanation that it comes from pop culture. The appearance of science fiction concepts in UFO stories doesn't teach us much about the UFO phenomenon itself, but it does tell us about the witnesses and how the media influences them. The trees shouldn't stop us from seeing the forest.